Good evening, comrades. Just while we're waiting to start formally, tonight's session is on the ILP, and it's going to be conducted by two of us, me and Matthew Jones, who will be promoting to a panelist. Because I'm afraid of another appointment, I will only be speaking for around about half an hour, and then Matthew will come in afterwards. So I'm hoping that Matthew will be promoted to panelist shortly, and then we can get going. Okay. Okay, comrades. Well, I will make a start, and as I explained just a few moments ago, tonight's session is a sort of double header between Matthew and I, and we're looking at the ILP in the 20s and 30s. Evening, Matthew. Matthew's going to look particularly at Clydeside, which in many ways is I suppose the sort of symbol of the thing that most people think of when they think of the ILP as a left grouping. Its importance on Clydeside in the 1920s. It then goes into something of a decline, but I'm sure Matthew will look at that. I'm going to speak for about half an hour or so, and then I'm afraid I have to leave, but Matthew can field any questions. And what I'm going to put into the chat is actually my email address. So if there are any questions that Matthew didn't cover, or you want to contact me to sort of follow up on anything, then this is where you can find me. It's my university work address. Okay, so the ILP and the left in the 1920s and 30s. I think I ought to begin by saying, although we think of the ILP as in many ways, one of the major forces of the Labour left, the ILP was not solely identified as a left-wing grouping. And indeed, some of the most right-wing Labour leaders, such as Philip Snowden and Ramsay MacDonald, were ILP members. And it's only really in retrospect, I think, that we've come to identify the ILP simply as the left. Even up until the late 1920s, it was quite possible for there to be a substantial, what we might call right-wing or mainstream Labour reformist grouping in the ILP. And really the reputation that the ILP has as a left-wing group, I think, really comes from the Clydesiders. And I think that in many ways is quite exaggerated. But I'm sure Matthew can either confirm that or disabuse us of that later on. But also in the 1930s, when after 1932, the ILP disaffiliates from the Labour Party, and it then becomes something of a battleground for various versions of leftism. And those versions of leftism will, I think, be important. But by this stage, the ILP is a small grouping, or relatively small. Its membership, for example, in 1932, when it disaffiliates, is around about 17,000. It might be as many as 20. Membership figures are a little difficult to entirely gauge. And that contrasts with maybe a Communist Party membership at that stage of between 5 and 10,000. And a Labour Party membership, although that would include trade union affiliations, of possibly close towards 500,000. So you can see that that in terms of numbers and so on, it's not a large organisation, but I think that it is politically significant. It's significant because in many ways in the 20s, the organised left in the party did congregate around the ILP, and also that the organised left amongst MPs congregated around the ILP. But that, as I said, was also had a paradox that in the ILP, there were also some of the most right-wing leaders. So simply being a member of the ILP did not confer sort of left-wing status. You didn't have to be left-wing to be in the ILP. And indeed, you know, in many ways, the dominant sort of line of the ILP was often not as far to the left as we might think. The other issue, of course, is that from the 1920s onwards, and this again I think is very important to note, is that there is a significant force outside of the Labour Party on the left, the Communist Party. And indeed, the sort of issues of left-wing politics, the debates within left-wing politics are now increasingly framed around support either for the Soviet Union as a model of socialism, but more importantly, the debates around the strategy of the Bolsheviks and its applicability to Western European countries. So whereas before 1917, 1918, it might be possible in a social democratic or in a Labour Party to have quite a wide range of views, after 1917, 1918, there's a clear dividing line. And even though there might well be people in the ILP, in the Labour Party, who might, for example, have sympathies with the Soviet Union, and as we will see in some of the strategies, there are echoes of the Russian Revolution, there is now a much clearer line, partly because of the organized existence of a Communist Party, but also because of the actual experience of the Russian Revolution. So in a way, everybody is framing their politics in relation to that. And I think that's quite important. Although I'm going to talk about the Labour left, there is this other pole of attraction, if you will, outside of it. And people have, in a sense, to sort of take a position on it. The other thing as well in the 1930s, I mean, really, I suppose, from 29 with the onset of the great crash, the economic crisis, is of course that the capitalist crisis and the idea of capitalism in crisis is really quite a major theme. So that many of the assumptions of reformist socialism, so that, for example, in the ILP in the 20s, MacDonald and others would argue for a sort of gradualist approach, and this still had a you know, a certain sort of cachet, even for the people who wanted you know, a much more radical approach. But the sense of crisis, mass unemployment, and you know, you know, the economic slump, and the fact that this is generalized and worldwide, I think then poses questions about dealing with unemployment, about dealing with capitalist crisis. And it means that ideas of gradual improvement and development, you know, lose a lot of their potency. And this also does see, I think, a move to the left, you know, in Labour, but also in the ILP as well. And then lastly, in the 30s, but you know, particularly from the early 30s, we get the emergence of fascism and the possibilities of a European and later a world war. So attitudes towards war, attitudes towards fascism, Nazism, how how the workers' movement deals with that, how it understands it. And above all, I suppose the questions that are going to be very important in terms of the left is not only how you characterize fascism, but how you fight it. For example, do you argue for a workers' united front, a movement of the workers' parties, the workers' organizations to confront fascism? Or do you, as was increasingly the line of the communist parties, go towards a popular front, which includes not only working class organizations, but also sections of the bourgeoisie, the so-called progressive bourgeoisie, middle class parties? And so you can see that this is a period in which there's some really very important questions are being posed. Now, you know, that's not to say that previously these questions weren't posed, but I think they're posed particularly sharply. So this is the context for the ILP that I'm going to look at. Just one point about the sort of organizational nature of the ILP, which is often quite confusing, I think, to comrades, simply because we still think of Labour in terms of individual membership. Now, the ILP was formed in the early 1890s, 1892, 83. So it was actually one of the component parts of the Labour Party. But up until 1918, as we've discussed in earlier sessions, there was no individual membership of the Labour Party. For individual socialists, most of them joined an individual organisation. It would be the ILP. The British Socialist Party was another organisation of this sort, likewise the Fabians. But the ILP would have been, in many places, would have been the Labour Party. Now, after 1918, we get the emergence of constituency Labour parties with individual membership, but we still get ILP branches. So alongside the Labour Party, the constituency, you will have an ILP branch. And indeed, in some areas, Clydeside is a good example of this. The ILP will actually be the Labour Party. It will be organisationally the structure of the Labour Party. And I think, again, an important point to note when we talk about the trajectory of the ILP. Now, the ILP moves to the left, partly under the impact of the emergence of the Clydeside group of MPs who form a coherent group that Matthew's going to talk about a little later, but also in response to the political and the social developments of the 1920s. And from the middle 20s, we get the emergence of a set of left-wing positions identified with prominent members of the ILP left, particularly James Maxton, and also a former member of the Communist Party, A.J. Cook, Arthur Cook, who was a miners' leader. Lawrence Parker last week talked about their campaign and the nature of the national left-wing movement. So you may well recall, recall that. Now, the politics of this group were framed clearly to the left of what we might think of as the gradualist and the reformist approach of Labour governments. The Labour government in 1924 had been a great disappointment. It had come into power as a minority government, and its abilities to do anything were very limited. But even so, its cautious politics, certainly led to criticism. And so in the aftermath of that, the ILP left starts to develop a set of programs which they focus on governmental power, and in particular, a set of policies which they refer to as socialism in our time. So the idea is that socialism is not something for the dim and distant future, that it's something that can develop within a foreseeable period of time. And in particular, this can be linked to Labour winning a majority. In other words, it will be a form of governmental socialism, utilizing the instruments of the state. Now, the form of this socialism in our time was in many ways a fairly early form of Keynesianism. It worked, it was very much influenced by underconsumptionist theories and the idea of deficit spending, or even just simply wage increases as a way of stimulating economic demand. So linking to, for example, government intervention, public ownership of major financial and utilities. You'd have a house building program, public works, strengthening of municipal socialism, it's a left program that would be really recognizable for many people on the Labour left today, and of course it would be very recognizable in the Labour government of 1945. So as a program, it's far to the left of the Labour government in 1924, and with the second Labour government of 1929 to 31, it is very clearly further to the left. And of course, the ILP left in Parliament are pushing these demands and demanding that Macdonald's government introduce them, and that the institutions of the state, that the Labour majority, or actually not strictly a Labour majority, but Labour as the largest largest party, be used, to implement these policies. Indeed, there was another sort of line here that's being put forward, is of course that if Labour's policies are sabotaged in any way by the other two parties, then it's argued that Macdonald should call an election and using a new majority or confronting the forces of reaction, introduce these policies. Now, Macdonald signally failed to do that. And moreover, when confronted with the financial crisis, particularly when it reached its peak in the summer of 1931, completely and openly went over to the bourgeoisie and formed the national government. So the development of the ILP is very much framed by that. Labour has not only failed to develop any sort of left-wing programme, but when confronted with the financial crisis, the right completely goes over to the capitalist class and cause a snap election. And in that election, Labour is decimated. It loses large numbers of its seats, and indeed the ILP is proportionally much stronger as a result of that election defeat. It retains, a larger number of MPs proportionately. Now, I've talked about the development of this left programme, but I've also want to talk about some contradictions within it, and indeed with the ILP's relationship with the Labour Party. Because although the ILP had large numbers of members and indeed MPs who were members of the ILP, they did not really function as a coordinated group. And when the ILP disaffiliates, this is on the basis of what had been a fairly sharp exchange on, I suppose, party organization and party discipline. And this had been brewing really, I think, from the late 20s. Now, it seems, I think, technical, but I think in essence it's political. Essentially, the ILP argued that its MPs should follow its party line. In other words, that it should operate, as the phrase was used at the time, as a party within a party. And its argument was that as one of the component parts and founders of the Labour Party with the distinctive position, then it had the right, in a sense, to do that. And of course, as its policy was to the left, and indeed, given the crisis in the party, its desire to do that, could make sense, beyond its own immediate ranks. But the Labour right, even before the Macdonald split, was attempting to undermine this. And when the Macdonald split occurred and sections of the right-wing leadership peeled off, the remaining leadership, many of whom were politically not that dissimilar to Macdonald, still wanted to, in a sense, exert control in this way. But they, of course, wanted to exert control, not just to exert control, but in order to enforce their political line. So the ILP's disaffiliation was largely around an organizational question of whether ILP MPs should follow the standing orders of the Parliamentary Labour Party. In other words, whether they should accept the discipline of the Labour Party. Remember, the Labour Party at this stage, although its membership has not noticeably declined, the people who went over to the national government were a very small minority. They were largely Labour MPs and a few of their hangers-on. The ranks of the party remain still largely affiliated to the party. So the ILP, now seeing itself essentially as the sort of left, had a decision to make about what to do, whether, for example, to pursue this organizational question, or whether to remain with the party and develop an opposition within that party. Now, as I've said, this sort of tendency away from the Labour Party had been occurring for several years, and indeed, when the split came, I think in many senses it was in a sense an accident. The leadership in particular had believed that they could use the possibilities of a conditional affiliation as a way of being something of a bargaining counter. But by this point, the numbers of ILP MPs who were operating under the discipline of the party were much smaller. And I think that the Labour leadership, Arthur Henderson in particular, and Henderson had been pretty well on the right. I mean, again, these people are not left-wingers. Saw this as an opportunity to really extend the power of the Labour right over what was left of the parliamentary party. Now, when the ILP did disaffiliate, it had around about 17 to 20,000 members or so. These were evenly spread throughout the country, but there were a number of strongholds, parts of London, parts of East London, Lancashire, particularly a strong area, and of course Scotland, particularly Greater Glasgow and Clydeside. There were other areas as well in West Yorkshire and some parts of Wales. But the ILP then was sort of firmly rooted in its areas, and indeed, given its historical role, had played an important role in the development of the Labour Party. Now, its development for the rest of the 30s is, I think, interesting because it becomes very much a battleground for ideas about the nature of a socialist strategy, both in terms of its aims, but also the means that these are going to be carried out. The party, as I said, does present itself as being on the left, and indeed, in its newspapers, in its debating journals and so forth, and in its meetings, it very quickly argues that it's looking for a new revolutionary policy. These are its words, and the idea that the ILP stands for socialist revolution becomes very explicit. Now, that phrase, revolutionary policy, is in many ways quite a vague, quite a sort of generalized idea, and quite what that means, is endlessly debated. So some comrades in the ILP are putting forward the idea of, for example, abandoning parliamentary work and attempting to develop workers' councils of action. And this, does very much run with an earlier approach that many of them had that might tend towards syndicalism. Some of them had moved in those positions before the First World War. But it's also based upon a reading of the nature of the state, and in particular the obstructions that the state and the ruling class might put in the way of a radical government. So you can see that the ideas are developing around, do we go for the election of a Labour government? Or are we talking about an insurrectionary policy? Some people arguing for a general strike as the strategy that would bring a workers' government to power. So you can see that within that parameter of revolutionary policy, the experience of the working class movement in the 20th century, is being debated and being explored. However, for others, a revolutionary policy simply means the election of a Labour government with a left-wing programme and trying to get that implemented. Although some of those people are arguing that a Labour government elected on with that sort of programme would have to carry out emergency measures. For example, arguing that the Emergency Powers Act, which had been introduced just after the First World War by the Lloyd George government, that should be utilised in a sense to rule by decree. So it's a sort of left radicalism in that way. So this policy debate, is conducted quite openly. You can read it and you can sort of gauge the nature of it, but it also very much reflects the development of quite organized groupings inside the ILP. Now, there are several different currents, and I don't really have time to explore them in the depth that I want to, but I suppose they come into three main trends. The first one, which up until about 1935 or so, it styles itself the Revolutionary Policy Committee. And this is a fraction that calls for a revolutionary policy and very quickly, I think, moves towards the position of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And indeed, what is very clear is that members of the Communist Party of Great Britain join the ILP and are working with it. But others in the ILP are, in a sense, evolving in that direction. And this revolutionary policy group, quite strong in London, but its programme is to work very closely with the Communist Party and indeed to seek affiliation to the Communist International. So you can see there that the pole of attraction for that left is very clearly towards the Soviet Union, and in a sense to have a type of intermediate policy moving from simply left parliamentarianism towards some form of revolutionary position. It's that type of argument that leads many people on the left internationally, for example, Leon Trotsky, to conclude that the ILP is moving in what Marxists refer to as a centrist position. Unfortunately, that phrase has been hijacked by other people in more recent years, and centrism then is, would nowadays be regarded as outright Bolshevism. But what Trotsky and what the left mean by centrism in that period is a policy that sort of veers between support for revolutionary politics, but then moves back towards reformism. And so you can see that in the ILP and this revolutionary policy group. Quite a large number of these people will in fact go towards the Communist Party and will join the Communist Party in around about 1935. Now, the other group on the left, much smaller, are various groups of people who are influenced by the ideas of Leon Trotsky. Some of those are people who are outside of the ILP who join it. Some are people inside the ILP who become interested in Trotsky's ideas. And indeed, some of them actually go and meet Trotsky and discuss with him. And you have there debates about strategy, particularly about fighting fascism, reactions to the developing imperialist crisis. And of course, when from the middle 1930s, we get the Popular Front policy coming in from the Communist Party, there'll be very clear differences between Trotskyists and those closer towards the CPGB and their Popular Front line. Now, the last group are, in a sense, almost the loyalists of the ILP. And these will go off in various directions. Some of them will leave the ILP, and they will form a group which initially is called the Unity Group. But of course, as you'd expect from a group called the Unity Group, it splits and leaves. And the Unity Group becomes the Independent Socialist Party, and it will eventually end up in the Labour Party. This group still sees itself in a way as sort of orienting towards the Labour Party. It still sees itself as a distinctly left group, and its policies are very clearly, I think, linked to the earlier traditions of the ILP. And by that, I mean that they're often very strongly pacifist. They often, for example, have what we might describe as a sort of ethical form of socialism, often stressing the sort of moral character of socialism, and opposition really to anything that might smack of not just unconstitutionalism, but of political violence and of revolution. And that does link back very much to the earlier ILP tradition. And that group will either go back into the Labour Party at various points during the 30s, or will, in a sense, seek affiliation in 1939 and will largely go back into the Labour Party either during the war or in the 1940s. So what's the significance of the ILP? Why is it important? Well, I'm just going to wind up on this point. Obviously, I've had to deal with this fairly quickly because of the truncated time I'm available this evening. I think its significance is really that it raises questions about the orientation of the Labour left and of people who've been part of the Labour Party or are in the Labour Party. And it's an example of how they might move to the left. And perhaps unlike the more recent period, these are people who moved to the left whilst already members of the Labour Party, rather than joining it, a la the Corbyn period, and then moving that party to the left. So what we have then, I suppose, is the sort of, the limits of their politics. And what they're trying to do is to explore those limits. And they're trying to do it in a period when there's economic crisis, when there's the threat of war and of fascism, but also when there's the experience of two Labour governments, and they are all trying to make sense of those phenomena. And of course, they're doing it, in ways which are new, because these are new experiences. But of course, they're also trying to do this in line with what's happening with other groupings. We've mentioned the Communist Party, which is very clearly a force on the left, which can act to influence the ILP, but also another current, another tendency within the Labour Party itself, which is actually made up of some people who were in the ILP but didn't leave, but stayed within Labour, the Socialist League, who again share many of the political attributes of sections of the ILP. But of course, the weakness, I think, of the ILP is that its reasons for leaving the Labour Party are not particularly political. It doesn't have, for example, a very clear strategy. Much of the political strategy discussion takes place after they've left. So, they're all clear they're going to leave, but then where they're going to go, they decide once they've gone out. It does sort of rather remind you of the person who sort of flounces out of the family home and says, right, I'm off. And off they go, and then they've got to try and work out where they're going to. That's possibly a little unfair, because there had been discussions on the left within the Labour Party about policy directions, but these were nowhere near resolved. So what we have then is a party which has many of the older elements, the ethical socialists, the pacifists, who are, left-wingers within the Labour sense, but they're not really part of this other left, which is now increasingly influenced either by the Communist Party or indeed by wider European experiences. And they're all really yoked together in this party. So the split over party discipline and over standing orders was much more focused, I think, on the ILP as a distinct identity. And remember that identity, that idea of being in the ILP could cover people who were clearly on the left, you know, and often moving in a revolutionary direction, but could also encompass really quite mainstream reformist politicians, ethical socialists, pacifists, and so on. And in a sense, holding those people together in a party will always have been difficult. But also what this strategy was going to be, I think, was never really clarified. So, you know, there are clear lessons for us today, but as Lawrence Parker said last week, and I have a certain sympathy with this, we should really look at this in its own terms and, you know, perhaps try to understand the appeal and the importance of party loyalty that many of these people had. They've been involved in this party for 40 plus years, and they saw themselves in a sense as the backbone, the bedrock of the Labour Party, but also, you know, to critique their, you know, the limits of their politics as well, and to understand that they were still working in many ways within the framework of the party and the movement which they'd left. They may well have organisationally left the Labour Party, but politically, you know, they remained really within it. But I'm afraid I have to leave now and go off and do some other teaching elsewhere. So I've left my email address if comrades want to get in touch with me, and then we can continue the discussion. So my apologies, and I'm sure Matthew will be able to field all those questions once I've gone. So thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, here is Matthew. Are you carrying on talking, or we?
Yeah, I'm just going to say a few things. I mean, obviously, unfortunately, I can somewhat substitute Kevin, but not to his depth of understanding. I think. I mean, you know, what I was going to say was a few things about the ILP in Glasgow and around about the, you know, in Clydeside. In terms of its, I mean, it's development in a lot of ways, as Kevin has said, you know, I mean, there are certain centres of the ILP, and, you know, one of which is in his city. Others being, you know, Yorkshire and Lancashire, because the ILP, of course, is founded in Bradford. You know, very strong also in Lancashire and also in parts of London. But here, of course, I mean, what you have is a series of, I mean, you know, obviously before the Labour Party becomes a membership organisation in 1918, effectively in this city, the ILP was the Labour Party. You know, in these terms, it's founded in Scotland a year later than in England in 1894. And of course, Keir Hardie, of course, who founds the Labour, is the founder of the Labour Party itself, is a member. And of course, throughout his life, he maintains a base in Scotland. I mean, despite, you know, obviously being MP in London and then in South Wales, he as an official of the Ayrshire Miners' Union based in Cumnock, he maintains a house in Scotland and maintains influence and activity within Scotland as effectively seen as the leader of the Labour Party, you know, and the ILP. And if you look at the you know, in terms of, you know, what happens in Glasgow, essentially the ILP has the real breadth and depth of membership. But you have a situation where there's an openness on the left. There's not a particularly it's not particularly divided. So the ILP publishes a regular newspaper, The Forward. You know, obviously as a tradition of international, most second international newspapers were named Forward after Voorwaarts of the SPD, and all sorts of people on the left publishing that in that paper, particularly obviously in the First World War. So you have the leaders of the BSP, the British Socialist Party, particularly obviously John Maclean, publish regularly in Forward, and then there is a debate actually around the war, because obviously then there's a split in terms of the war, I mean, the ILP has a broadly pacifist position within the war, is against the war on a pacifist basis. The BSP has a different position, being against the war on a far more class basis. But within that, you also have a section of people who are in favour of the war, actually, who are still in the ILP. And then there is a debate in the newspaper. There was actually a fairly regular column by at least one person who was in favour within that newspaper. A person who was in favour of the war, and obviously you then have in terms of the Clyde Workers' Committee, which is the key organisation of the working class. That is the Stop Suez movement, which is the real militant cutting edge of the working class industrially. That in that body, the BSP, although a smaller body than the British Socialist Party, although a smaller body than the ILP, has a real weight in terms of its leading members being present on that committee. But the ILP, in contrast, has the weight in terms of organising, larger demonstrations, organises, around the rent strikes, organises demonstrations against passive demonstrations against the war, mass demonstrations against the war, which of course largely were composed of women, because obviously they wanted to avoid. One is a means of mobilising women, and two, they wanted to avoid violence, which obviously with a demonstration of men against the war would likely have met with fairly extreme violence. So you have this organisation, and you have a left, as I say, which is not differentiated. Particularly, people, the publication, primary publication, being run by the ILP, and not on a sort of factual basis. So, I mean, come the end of the war, actually, of course, the ILP then recruits in the crisis at the end of the war, and then the ILP in a few months, the end of 1918, recruits hugely, and obviously into Red Friday in 1990, recruits hugely. Grows enormously, more than everybody else, and then of course has the leading figures. If you look at the MPs who were elected from Glasgow, afterwards, particularly in 1922, you see that the ILP predominates, and particularly, obviously, the standout figure. I mean, obviously, you can go through. There's a number of people who are extremely important, from John Wheatley, who organises in the council, Patrick Dolan, who's again a key organiser, and really the outstanding figure in terms of as an orator. And a politician is James Maxton, again a school teacher. I mean, you can look at the leadership of the BSP public leadership is John Maclean, school teacher, sacked and imprisoned, and the ILP's front man really is James Maxton, again a school teacher, sacked, imprisoned. And actually becomes a manual worker. Actually works in the factory because it's the only job available to him when he's released. But then becomes an MP in 1922 for Brigton, which is very interesting, because Brigton, of course, is traditionally not particularly left. If you go there, it's not it's more of an orange area, and the certainly the Labour Party, the ILP, is generally of a tendency to be of Catholic nature, but he holds that seat as an ILP MP until he dies in 1946, and become as the leading figure in terms of the whole evolution of the ILP. So the problem for the ILP then becomes the question that one, after the First World War, of course, and there's this real heavy depression and the collapse of heavy industry, and after the war orders dry up, and this catches out a whole series, not just the working class, but the whole series of important industrial organisations in Glasgow, particularly Beardmores, which is one of the major industrial organisations in the city, and huge numbers of people laid off. And the problem for the ILP in this, of course, is that actually, of course, it confronts two tendencies on either side. First of all, obviously, the Labour Party becomes an individual membership organisation. You can join either the ILP as an affiliate, or you can join the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, of course, charges less. The ILP actually finds that large numbers of its members, come the depression of the early 20s, are unable to pay their membership dues, which are, as I say, much higher than those of the Labour Party. And then it's, of course, the squeeze in terms of who's members of what. And on the other side, you have the evolution of the Communist Party. I mean, obviously, from the question of the BSP collaborating, in many ways with the ILP and the rest of it, you see the evolution of a Communist Party, which takes off a chunk of the left. I mean, actual whole branches of the ILP here join the Communist Party, and a couple of leading members, Helen Crawford and one other person, joined from the ILP to the Communist Party. It's very, I mean, it's and there's always that pressure on the ILP itself. So it is left really, as at the point of decline, really, from that. And when you come to the disaffiliation, of course, of the ILP in 1931, of course, this is a major problem for ILP in Scotland, because actually I think a half of its membership remains in the Labour Party as what was called the original version of the Scottish Socialist Party. Interesting, that. So it loses a chunk of that and its influence, and that then declines. And actually, the whole thing actually in the 40s is wound up into the what was called independent Labour publications. And in fact, the independent Labour publication continued until the 70s, although tending to be in the orbit of the Communist Party, actually, ironically enough. Because obviously the other thing, of course, the ILP was a member of what they called the 2.5 International, including, of course, the POUM in Spain, and it sent a number of people to fight in the Civil War and were savagely repressed by the same Communist Party. So yeah, okay. I think we should open to questions and contributions. Thanks, Conrad.
So, comrades, if you have anybody got any comments or questions, thank you very much, Matthew. Sorry, I'm keeping my camera off because I'm in bed with my daughter who's ill. Does anybody have any questions or contributions? We can make you into panelists and then you can speak. Okay, there's Felicity DeMotta and Steve Freeman who are just about to become panelists. Please, anybody else, put your hand up, click raise hand, or put in the chat if you're having problem finding that particular button. Okay, there's Steve. I suggest we take him first. Hello, Steve.
I'll mute myself first of all.
There you go.
Right, thanks, Matthew, and Kevin, who's now departed us, but thanks to both of you. I'm obviously, everybody knows where I'm coming at this from, so I'll just set that. I'm obviously looking for let's say, the Republican tradition through the 1930s to see where it was in England. Now, there were three trends, it seems to me, that are indicated on the left. There's left reformism, there's a kind of Republican socialism, and then there's a left communism. So it seems to me, following what Kevin said, Republican socialism, where's that? Well, that's James Connolly, isn't it? Obviously, and it's also John Maclean. So those two very important figures in the left in Britain, not in this period, by the way, but there was the tradition there. Now, if you look at the ILP, the way that Kevin has, and I don't know a lot about the ILP, the way Kevin has told us, really, the ILP has got two trends within it. There's a left reformist trend, a rightist trend, if you like, and a sort of left communist trend. Now, the left reformist trend wants the election of a Labour government with a socialist monarchist program of some kind, rather like 1945, as far as I can tell, because it's practical and realistic. The left communist trends, they've got a lot of revolutionary rhetoric about insurrections, general strikes, abolishing parliament and things of that type. So there are both of these trends, which are actually different forms of economism. They are, in a sense, mirror images of themselves. You know, they're both kind of wrong, but they can both point out where the other lot went wrong. So the ILP seems to have both of those things in its. I don't know, and whether you can tell me, is whether the ILP wanted to abolish the monarchy. I know that Keir Hardie did, but I always make the point that abolishing the monarchy is not really republicanism. It's only a sort of a baby step towards it. You can see that if you see John Wheatley's politics. And I don't know if John Wheatley was ILP, Matthew, but I mean, he's certainly Clydeside, it probably was, but I don't know for sure. He was, yeah. Yeah, it was. Well, Wheatley's famous phrase was, he said, and Clement Attlee took this up, he said, I wouldn't lift a finger to turn a capitalist monarchy into a capitalist republic. Now think about that. That sounds quite, you know, like sounds quite socialistic, that, doesn't it? You know, he wouldn't do what they did in Russia, where the capitalist monarchy called Tsarism became still a capitalist republic in February, and then went on to October, where it became much more democratic, and capitalism still wasn't abolished there. So he wouldn't do what they did in Russia, according to that. But Clement Attlee said he wouldn't do that either in the 1930s. He wouldn't lift a finger to turn a capitalist monarchy into a capitalist republic. Therefore, he said, I'm going to support the king then. Obviously, that's the obvious conclusion. If you're not going to do that, there's nothing wrong with having a monarchy then in that case. So republicanism then, well, where was the republicanism? It wasn't in England. Where was it? Well, it was in Spain. Obviously, there was a republican struggle going on in Spain. There was another one going on in Germany, where the Weimar Republic was being overthrown by fascism. And in Italy, where a constitutional monarchy had a fascist leader in Mussolini and was going to become a republic in 1945. And in the Soviet Union, which already was a republic, but had no democracy in it. You know, it was a kind of formal Stalinist monarchy without democracy. So there was a lot of republicanism going on in the 1930s, but it certainly wasn't in England where the ILP was. It was in Ireland, it was in all these other places. So the problem, therefore, with the ILP really was it's wrong on both counts. It was left reformist on one side, and it was sort of a left communist, anti-parliamentarian on the other. Both of these things seems to me to be a fundamentally flawed perspective. So these two faces then of left reformism and left communism, I think where the ILP failed as such, didn't get to real change. I'll stop there. I think that's a good place to stop.
Thank you, Steve. Matthew, did you want to respond straight away? I want to hear some other comrades first.
Well, only briefly. I think the important thing about the ILP, of course, is there is a debate on all things, but it does tend to be, the ILP does have this strong, you know, sort of ethical socialist thing. It's not particularly ideological in those terms, and it doesn't, in many ways, go into you know, in-depth political debate to the degree that you get in a more Marxist organisation. So in those terms, the point, of course, obviously, is you get different trends, you know, all over. And according to, you know, people's political evolution. I mean, think about it. I mean, Wheatley is quite radical in terms of his, you know, support for the housing struggle, but he's also a devout Catholic, and you know, in some ways quite right wing. So there's a lot of contradiction thrown in there, you know, in those terms, and you know, not you know, in terms of actually not the degree of political clarity you would get with an organisation that was more based on a you know, a more in-depth political debate. I think is an important thing to say about
Okay, Felicity is next. Hello, comrade.
Yeah, hi. Mine really carries on from what I can't remember. It's Steve was speaking about republicanism, but I've now got another tack. I don't know if anybody can answer what impact or to what extent did the ILP, do people think, have an impact on the Attlee government and on the Wilson government? Do you think there's an impact? I mean, I think that the ILP strand was greatly lost after that. But what impact do you think the ILP, both parts of the ILP, you might say, had on, as I say, the Attlee and the Wilson governments? That's it, really. Thanks.
Tony, please.
What, me? Yeah.
Yes, you're Tony, right?
All right. Okay, thanks. I don't have a great deal to bring to this discussion because I really come here to learn, not to pontificate, as it were. But the question which arises for me is, what is the relevance and what is the relation? What lessons do we learn in terms of what we do today? Because it seems to me that in 1919, after the First World War, was a period of great class struggle. I mean, not only in Glasgow and the Clydeside, but in places like Liverpool, for example, where the troops were sent in and they shot 2 strikers dead. Today, in Scotland, in Glasgow, I mean, the Labour Party has virtually no influence. It's lost every single MP bar one. It's been replaced by a bourgeois nationalist government, the SNP, which I think be described as Tartan Tories. So do you think there are any lessons or what is the relevance of this in the sense and the lessons to be drawn in terms of what we do today? I mean, that's my question.
Thanks, Tony. Before I bring in Matthew, there's a couple of questions in the chat, in the Q&A. Faraz basically asks what Tony's asked, what could it teach us about today? And Mary's asking, what's wrong with left communism?
Yes, I saw those questions. I think I'll start with Felicity. I think the important thing about the if you look at particularly the Attlee government, of course, is the number of people who were members of that government who were members of the ILP at one point. Obviously the organisation itself is by that point as near enough gone, but it actually carries over in terms of its personnel. So quite a number of the ministers of the Attlee government had been members of the ILP, including the likes of Jenny Lee and numerous others. So it did have that and also as has been pointed out, the formation of the Socialist League, which was the organisation of the left, effectively the Labour Party, was around those people in the ILP who refused to leave when the ILP itself disaffiliated. So obviously in the Stafford Cripps and others, and obviously in a war in terms of the effort to the Socialist League itself is banned by the Labour Party. There's quite hardline ideological warfare going on here. So you've got a whole series of people who become ministers in the 45 government who've previously actually been expelled from the Labour Party and then let back in again. So I think in those terms, it's important as a formative point for quite a lot of people, and a chunk of the left of the Labour Party. I think in terms of, I think the questions of the Q&A. I think the issue of left-wing communism, of course, is much more a phenomenon of Germany and a certain element of people in Britain around Sylvia Pankhurst, actually. So there's a different question that's actually written about. It's actually there is quite a long literature about it written by both those who were left communists and, of course, Lenin's famous answer, left-wing communism, an infantile disorder, but not really relating to the ILP. I mean, at that point, of course, it was an argument within the strand of the Communist Party itself. I think in terms of what do we understand for today? I mean, I think it as I say, it's a particular strand of politics of its time, but I think obviously there's echoes today in terms of an understand, how people understand things, and in terms of how people organise. I mean, the thing is that the left now is a great deal more disorganised, and probably even more unclear about how it understands the world than the ILP was. At least the ILP had an actual mass base in the working class to a degree, and could point to a tradition of actually organising, particularly in communities, and in this city in particular, which is more than can be said for a lot of other people, and certainly I think beyond what the left of the Labour Party can put up now.
Okay. Has anybody got any other questions or comments?
What about the Wilson government, the Wilson governments? You didn't answer that.
Well, I think as I say, I think the problem being, of course, with that is that by that time, a lot of those people have gone. I mean, they actually get too old. I mean, Bevan.
But you had Jenny Lee and people like that. Yeah.
I mean, they're retired by the time you get to Wilson. So you're really, I mean, by the time you get to 1964, I mean, those, you're looking at an organisation which really had its heyday was the First World War in the 20s into the 30s, and then by the time you get to the 60s, I mean, most of those guys are retired. So I mean, it is a tradition, but it because it runs out. Effectively, it runs out. It doesn't have the impact it had previous. In those terms.
And today, any impact?
Well, I think there's something to be gained from studying it, in terms of it's what can we learn from it. I mean, it was in many areas extraordinary. It was very successful in organising a mass organisation, particularly in community organisation, in some areas, and I think okay, we can then say what were the political mistakes and whatever else, and what can we learn from those as well, and it did produce. I mean, here, of course, the name Maxton, because James Maxton was such an impressive guy, particularly as an orator, actually had an echo in this city. I mean, his nephew got elected in Cathcart, in the seat I live in 1979, over 30 years after Maxton died, essentially on the basis of Maxton's name, although he was a pretty colourless right-winger, but he had the name, as opposed to Maxton, who was a brilliant orator and was, based himself on mobilising a mass organisation.
Okay, Faraz has a question, I think.
Yes, I came in a bit late. Thanks, Matthew. You've given us a view from the times of the organisations, the view of the organisations, but what did the worker, you mentioned oratory, how would they have experienced politics and those groups? Like, were they, did they have education? Were they too busy? I don't get a feeling from the workers' point of view what they were thinking.
Okay, Marie's got a question coming in now. Heike
Yes,
Mai.
I don't know if it's a question. It seems to me what has shaken the whole period of history is the actual taking of power in 1917 by the working class for the first time in history, demonstrating that it was possible and that this was the class to change society and to start taking hold, to start taking control of the economy so that the economy would stop being at the service of a few people. I have, yes, a question in the sense that Steve talked about left reformism and left communism, which would have influenced the ILP. I'm not so sure about that. I understood what he was saying about February 1917, which I accept was still well, a sort of monarchy in some continuation. But in October, I think Steve leapt over the October bit. And the October bit was when the Soviets, which were assemblies everywhere, had created regional Soviets and then the Central Soviets, which allowed the party to take power. Surely this was an example of democracy functioning 100% as best one could have wanted it. It was the people in assemblies who were deciding as best they could, of course, in a world which was opposed. They were deciding to get out of capitalism in an enormous determination to see that society should be for the benefit of the mass of the people. And so I think that what Kevin and what Matthew have described was the shakeup that this has created throughout the whole period. This is why a Communist Party was created in Britain. This is why the ILP some people were very influenced, and people were very impacted by and this impact is still going on now. But my question then would be, what happened in 1926? In 1926, the Soviet Union intervened to help the failure of the general strike. And surely that must have had a tremendous impact on the Labour Party and the ILP. And I would have wanted, well, if it's possible, to see in what way this fits into our discussion. And it seems to me that they didn't develop any left communism after that. It was the Soviet Union that was declining, that was retreating, and which did not provide a leadership, like, for example, from the general strike to making Soviet forms of democratic forms. They didn't talk about this. On the contrary, they weighed against the general strike through the TUC, which was the trade union bureaucracy. So it wasn't left communism from then on. It was communism, right-wing communism, it seems to me, with the rise of Stalin. And Stalin, in fact, destroyed the democratic basis of the revolution with a policy of coexistence, pacific coexistence with world capitalism, and in Britain by forcing the defeat of, helping to help the defeat of the general strike, and then the return, of course, of capitalism on the basis of feeling encouraged by the Russian Revolution not seeming to be an enemy, or not seeming to be so dangerous anymore. So it seems to me that needs revising. And well, I would say that it was not left communism, it was communism without the Soviets. And that was a right-wing sort of communism.
Yep. Thank you, Mary. Felicity is asking in the Q&A if you know by any chance, Matthew, if the ILP had an impact, and if so, which impact on Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn? I think that was the last question. Would you like to come in and sum up now?
Okay, yeah, no, I think, I mean, to take the piece on Tony Benn, and I think that, you know, Ben has a far more overall view of the world, you know, than Jeremy Corbyn, and presents, you know, as a written extensively on what it is. And of course, he comes from a Quaker tradition, which, I mean, it does tie into the ILP, and it would be interesting, I think. I mean, you know, you need to go and compare, you know, in terms of the debate in the ILP versus what Ben wrote. But I think you'd probably find a parallel between, you know, what you know, Ben's view of the world, and at least, you know, a strand, a substantial strand within the ILP. I think that's a reasonable parallel. I think that Faraz's piece on in terms of the working class, and in terms of, you know, the how, you know, the understanding of the world and the rest of it. I mean, it's important. I think it's useful to see, you know, that what you get is both the tendency, you know, of you know, the intellectual, more intellectual elements, you know, within, obviously, and the conditions in which, you know, university and so on was not available to much of the working class youth and so on. That, you know, the two leaders in this city are both school teachers who've been to university, and you know, either come from a proletarian background in the case of Maclean, or else, you know, come from a more middle class background in the case of Maxton, and go over to the left. But you also have a considerable, you know, tradition of you know, work, debate, political debate, you know, autodidacts and so on, and the work, you know, workers actually debating and discussing and reading and so on. And you have a position in which, you know, say for instance, on Glasgow Green, you know, there are regular speakers every weekend on anything you like, you know, whether it's, you know, particularly obviously religion and socialism, and you know, people will go and practice their oratory and develop their ideas and debate and so on, and that's how it worked for years. And you know, you can see that there's that tradition within the working class of you know, both a collaborative view of, you know, developing a political debate, but also intense study by a key layer of the working class, and then, you know, moving itself into leading positions in terms of, you know, either the unions or into Parliament and so on. You know, you get the bulk of the MPs, and, you know, particularly obviously the radical MPs of 1922, the ILP MPs, all, you know, come out of the union struggle, in many cases out of the Clyde Workers Committee directly. You know, obviously move in political directions, you know, in various political directions subsequently, but that's where they come from. You know, it is a solidly working class thing. You know, and it's one of the things that really annoys about them, of course, that they are working class and they are entering Parliament as exactly that class, you know, whatever their political thoughts. I think that, you know, in terms of the discussion in terms of 1917, I think I need to go and look at the question of the general strike. I mean, obviously, it is a key point, as I said. You know, that you get a situation, obviously, in which the Communist Party obviously is wrong, you know, calling for, you know, all power to the TUC, who quite clearly don't want anything to do with power, and actually, you know, accede to the government at the first, you know, when that point is made to them, you know, by the government of the day, you know, that the power they can now wield power, and they openly say they don't want to, and clearly, you know, act to shut the whole thing down and leave the miners isolated for to leave their staff back to work and destroy, you know, whole chunks of the organisation, the working class. A great defeat, and that, you know, in those terms, I mean, the fact that the Stalinists, the sort of Stalinisation of the Comintern, you know, is instrumental in that, is a great defeat. I don't know. I need to go and look in terms of what the position of the ILP was, but I suspect it was a great deal more confused even than the Communist Party. So, in those terms, I think you know, we can see the ILP itself as a tendency which comes out of, you know, the rise of the workers' movement, you know, the 1890s and so on, and then in turn, you know, actually has an enormous impact, particularly around the First World War and into the 20s. But then, of course, has an issue in terms of where does it go in terms of these two different poles, or actually more, that are pulling against it. First of all, obviously, the Labour Party itself, you know, becoming in many ways institutionalised into the state, you know, from 2024 onwards in particular. And on the other side, you know, the Communist Party, the Stalinisation of the Communist Party, the evolution of the Trotskyist movement has an influence on in terms of, you know, that part of the, as Kevin points out, the parts of the Trotskyist movement which come out of the ILP, or have influence and pull people out of the ILP, and this more ideological and more in-depth politics actually pulls the whole thing apart. And you know, it is, as I say, there's influence, you know, in terms of its of the effect of its personnel after the Second World War, but in terms of its, you know, its organisation is gone by then, and it's a question. Well, okay, you know, in a way, that's you know, in terms of a political an ideological battle in which things are, in which positions have evolved, and the ILP is ripped apart by those tendencies. You know, while not actually you know, being able to form pole itself, would be my conclusion. So yes, thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrades. I think that was a bit of a strange session because, well, our main speaker had left, but thank you very much, Matthew, for stepping into the breach and doing a very, very fine job at it. Thank you very much, comrades. We'll see you all again next week, if not before. Bye-bye, comrades.
Cheers, thank you.
Thank you.